Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome,
Hi.
welcome, welcome. Thank you all for being here with us. This is we just kind of realized we're coinciding with Spill the Tea. So we thank you if you're able to join us live. And if you are watching later, we hope you had tons of fun at Spill the Tea. Wish we were there. Um, we are so happy that we're going to be joined this morning in just a moment by Alix Nicoud. He is here now off camera and will be showing a presentation. And we're just going to wait one more minute. Reminder, if you're joining muted. And we just would ask that everybody stay muted, stay off camera so we can have a easier time just kind of making this recording available on YouTube. And then you don't have to be like off in the corner if you don't want to be on YouTube in that capacity. Okay. All right, Kelsey,
Yes.
send us
So
a
welcome. This is our first lecture in the spring lecture series and a particularly special one for us. We have both now read Alix Nicoud's debut Trans for Trans historical romance medieval set as well, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about this morning, As Old as Thyme. And Alix is somebody who has been a supporter of Romancelandia University from the beginning. And so we are just so excited to have him on today to talk about their book and to tell us a little bit more about their research and to really walk us through the inspiration for writing a medieval set T for T romance. So we will go ahead and welcome Alix.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. So
We're
excited.
so delighted. So first, as a supporter of Romancelandia University from the start, you're a prolific reader of historical romance, especially medieval historical romance in the time period, but also trans historical romance, and have been our guidepost for others in leading others to selecting and prioritizing trans historical romances. So would love to learn a little bit more just as we start out about your own reading journey, where you started in the subgenre, what pulled you into the subgenre, where you read now.
Yeah, so I think honestly, like everyone in this sort of thing, they say, yeah, as a child, I've read my mother's historical romances. And of course, when I was younger, I couldn't read in English, so I only read in French. So it was a bit different available books. And for preteens and teens and children, a lot of French literature is historical. So a lot of Romans, a lot of medieval, Versailles, and there's some Roman subplots. So I can kind of say I started there without it being a proper historical romance. It's just whatever I borrowed at the library. But proper, I would say, historical romance. My first one was Olivia Waite's The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics, because it was a time, it was, I don't know, 2023, and I was only almost reading Sapphic romances. So there were not a lot available. There were some, and this was the most popular one. So I read it, I loved it, and it reminded me how much I loved historical as a romance genre in general, just reading historical stories. But because there were not a lot of things available, and I was not very into, I would say, English Regency Victorian area, I didn't read more. And then it was actually you when I decided, when someone told me about Romaneslandia University, I said, I had a lot on my, I have a lot of Sapphic historical romances I've never really read. And that's the perfect opportunity for me to properly spend time reading those. So full circle moment as well.
That's incredible. And I love The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics.
No,
That
it
was good.
feels such a fitting introduction for you, somebody who your own book has so many like I don't know, scientific leanings.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it was the perfect title.
Yeah.
That is a great book title. That book title called to me for a long time before I read the book. I was like, that's just a lady's guide to celestial mechanics. That's beautiful.
It's a beautiful story. And Olivia Waite has been such a champion for the genre too,
Yes,
which is so exciting. So it's fun
yes.
to have her books as an entry point when she's so good about reading, recommending, and celebrating historical romance authors. So I want to talk a little bit more about your indie debut and your novella debut. I know you have written other shorts and other stories that you may or may not want to talk about, but specifically looking at As Old as Thyme, which is fresh out this session, available now on Amazon as an ebook for any students who want to participate and read. Those who have not had a chance to read it yet, it's set in 7th century France. And as we said, T for T romance featuring lots of medieval chemistry, which we'd love to hear more about, HRT, contraception, abortifacients. It's also a beautiful childhood friends to lover story, which is a favorite of mine, and has a great reunion moment. Like, we definitely know each other, which I very much
I
enjoyed.
love that moment.
Love that moment. So what inspired you to choose this particular setting? Because I know, and you've talked about this before, Alix, that this setting, even for medieval historical romance, is much earlier than a lot of the ones that we're most familiar with. So I'm curious, what about 7th century France really drew you and compelled you to write this specific story?
Yeah, so I mean, what's really interesting about the Middle Ages is that it's a millennia, it's 1,000 years old. There's so much happening, and then we just collapse it into like a single thing when there are so many changes. So maybe before I come to the actual reason why I set it in this time, I kind of want to give people a small overview about the time it's set in and what it means, 7th century France, because I guess a lot of people are not familiar with French history. I don't know where the viewers are from, but I would assume that only if you went through French education you would know. I mean, of course, the Middle Ages didn't start on a single date, on a single year, but technically we say like mid to end of the 5th century is when France was under Gaul, I would say, was under the Roman Empire. Then they got, I mean, the Roman Empire fell, and then the Frankish Germanic tribes came and conquered and became kings of France. And we just end the period to somewhere around the Renaissance and the fall of the Byzantine Empire. So usually in France, we separate the time period by dynasty, so which kings ruled. So from the fall of the Roman Empire to 1751, it was the Merovingian, and then later the Carolingian. People know about Charlemagne. Charlemagne, sorry, I don't always do the English accent. Then the Capetian, and then you can know Eleanor of Aquitaine, famous, the Black Plague, and then during the Valois dynasty, there was Joan of Arc. So that means that if we talk about As Old As Thyme, this is set during the Merovingian dynasty, so maybe one of the earliest point in time. And if you compare it to maybe something a bit more famous, Emmett Denny's medieval books, there's actually a bigger time gap between As Old As Thyme than between A Vow Made Twice to us today. So there's a lot happening, like things are changing, and while those are both medieval stories, they're very different. And the story is that at first, the first initial pitch for the story for me was an alchemist and a witch. And an alchemist meant that it was after the 12th century, because of how it happened in Europe. And the characters were called Mao and Jean, which are medieval names I really love. And then I realized that it wouldn't really work, because towards the later end of the medieval period, that's when women's rights get more diminished, I would say. Like it gets worse in terms of rights for women towards the end. So I knew that if I went at the beginning, I would have more freedom playing with those characters and maybe what they can and could do in those times. And another big factor was, in fact, the chemistry of the book. I wanted the character to feel like they've inherited something from maybe the Roman or the Greek or maybe older type of chemistry or thinking. And this could not have been possible if I said that 500 years later, there was just not this continuity. So I completely scrapped the first timeline, and then everyone went to the Merovingian.
That's fast. It's really sobering to realize that about the Emma Denny series is closer to us in modern day, and really underscores your point that this is a really wide range of time that we lump into kind of Middle Ages, medieval time in our modern thinking, and really underscores just how different, early Merovingian to later periods would really be to a story.
Yeah, Merovingians are, for example, I guess it's around the Anglo-Saxon time for the British reference, which is also very underexplored. And until I would say, I mean, the 11th century, usually you don't see stories set before that. Maybe people had heard of Charlemagne like that, but like this is not even, or maybe you've heard the word Carolingian, but we are predating the Carolingian, and this is a 200 or so, 250 years old period. Like this is so long, and we know nothing, and no one ever writes story about what's happening in this exact time period.
Which to your point also gives you a lot of creative leeway in what these characters might have brought forward from previous time periods, and to your point from the Romans, and bringing into your story.
Exactly. I mean, for the sources, that was great because we have so little sources that I could have a good overview of the sources and then pick and choose what I wanted. I took a lot of inspiration from little Roman things. At one point, they play a dice game, which was a Roman game. And then I could choose something from the more later medieval. Could be slightly anachronistic, but I got a little bit, but could have already existed at the time. So, yes.
Well,
Yeah.
they would
That's
have
so great. That's what's so great about the early medieval, but no one writes about the early medieval.
I just looked up For My Lady's Heart is in the 1370s. So that's way after where this story takes place.
yeah, thinking of our, what we think of as kind of medieval touch points. Yeah, and that would
Mhm.
even be after the,
After the Emma Denny series.
yeah,
Well, yeah.
yeah.
Um, so what something that I really find interesting about your story is that it's so cozy. Like Plunal has this beautiful, cozy life. And it's full of some peril related to her profession, um, and how people in the town view that. But she has this like cottagecore existence. And when I don't read a ton of medieval romance because I think my introduction to medieval romance was For My Lady's Heart, and it was all peril all the time. It was like, whoa, don't eat that. Somebody might have poisoned you. Everybody's always going to try to poison you if you have any amount of power, money, privilege. Somebody's always, you have to look over your back. Oh, Black Plague. Oh, don't eat that. Oh, somebody's coming with a knife. And like it was just so much peril that I read that book. I was so exhausted. I was like, I don't think I like this time period. And I just put it down. And then recently I read the first Emma Denny book, and that was like pretty readable. I was like, okay, like I can hang with this. And I read your story and I was like, okay, now we're talking.
This
Like
is
I want to
definitely,
see some slice of life. I just need the
I
reassurance that you can just have like a safe life
mhm.
anytime. You know what I mean? I know
yeah, but
I
it's
know the
like
system needs it.
that's also the thing about, like when we think about medieval romances, it's like knights and castles and ladies and
Yeah.
princesses. But I guess people who just live in the village are not having those adventures. They just live in the village, they till the fields, they just work, and nothing is happening like that.
I love it. Good for them.
Hashtag small town romance. I mean, you've really
Exactly.
captured that. Yeah,
Yeah.
like
Small town romance. Mwah.
and evading some of, not evading, but working against some of the classism that we do, to your point, because a lot of medieval romance is dealing with a highly either like aristocratic class, or
Mhm.
I mean little kings, princes, princesses. We're looking at authority figures. We're not looking at the common day people.
Yeah, I want to see what the serfs are getting up to.
Yeah. Well, and also, I didn't realize until your timeline, we're so far before the Black Plague. And I think we
Yes.
underestimate how much the Black Plague does inform a lot of like later historical romance that we read, or not just historical romance, but fiction,
Yeah.
because it was such a seminal event. And really, as we think about back to our talk with Jillian and infectious
Uh,
disease and all of these things, the Black Plague is such a like stake in
Or
the
like
ground.
I think this came up when we talked to Jillian, but there was like a moment in the early 2020s where we were like, we do not want to watch a TV show that talks about COVID. We do not want to read a story that talks about COVID. And then suddenly it was just kind of in a lot of stories and on a lot of things that we're seeing on our screen. And it's not something that we can culturally hide from. It's not something that like happened, is gone. We don't need to we don't need, it's
Yeah.
not like that. So you imagine like the Black Plague becomes this thing where it's like, if you're writing poetry, if you're writing a play, if you're keeping a journal, you're going to be talking about this. This is a huge part of your life and the grief that has shaped it and the peril that exists within it.
I mean,
The parallels are
I,
there.
I would I was thinking about, which part of the medieval I would never write, and Black Plague is number one. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, first of all, if you write a Black Plague story, your main characters will lose their entire family, probably their entire friend group as well, if they are like any children. Like, I mean, I don't remember the exact number on the top of my head, but that was devastating.
Yeah.
So it's just like not a Roman setting, or if you wanted to, you could make it work, but it would be pretty hard. And in general, I just don't like writing about diseases. Just
Yeah.
Laura Kinsale, you are not, and that's fine.
It's not slice of life if you're
Yeah,
doing
it's not
a
slice
no.
of life.
story. I love that. And I love just getting a better sense of the timeline because you're correct. I mean, Emily and I both came through American school systems. We were not learning about Charlemagne and Joan of Arc in this context. I think that American school systems will pull out, just we're a very individualistic culture and historical context. So we'll pull out little knights and heroes that we can talk about, individually, but we never study this in context. So it's incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I realized that because I was like, this was titled like Merovingian work in progress in my file, and then I realized like it really means only something to me and no one else.
We appreciate that you have made this accessible for those of us who are so unfamiliar with these time periods.
I have to be honest and say I don't think that Merovingian was a word that was in my brain until we were making the post with your lecture title.
Absolutely. I would admit to not knowing Merovingian time period.
Yeah.
Well, and this also kind of leads to my next question. We talk a obviously it's very prevalent in historical romance circles right now, just the lack of publisher attention to historical romance. But if historical romance is suffering a lack of publisher attention, medieval romance within historical romance is like suffering a real lack of publisher attention. So I'm curious,
Yes.
and we've had this conversation before, Alex, just
Yes.
like what is it that draws people to or pushes people away from medieval romance? And I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I gave it some thought and I made a little list. And I think one of the main thing is potentially what Emily was talking about and reminding me of that is that medieval times suffer like some from bad stereotype from something like I would say I don't know, Game of Thrones, right? They're super violent. There's a lot of misogyny. Women are treated horribly. Blood, and then people always dying from disease and famine as well. Like generally, you don't expect it to be cozy. You don't expect it to be a good setting, maybe for romance. And I think a lot more people do not want to see violence against women anymore in violence, and this is something that's less interesting. And I think this leads into the second thing is that if you want those aesthetics, you can find them in fantasy. So if you want knights, tournament princesses, fantasy exists, and with fantasy you can remove all the your real or imagined stereotypes about medieval time periods.
Mm.
And then I think then there's just problem with research because to write something like a Regency romance, you have already read a lot of Regency romances. You have TV shows, the sources are more I don't know the word. It's easier to access the sources. You have first person diaries from a number of people who lived at that time. The resources are accessible in English, which is a big thing. And so it's just you have you know where to start. Whereas this was already very overwhelming for me to know exactly what I needed to know about this time period. If you take like 19th century, they're a lot closer to us, so you don't have to change everything you know about the world. Um, and then I think finally, um, medieval Romans, they suffer from a perceived lack of diversity, I would say. Um, and it's both real, but the idea that there could never be different stories told in medieval times because of perceived the stereotypes of the time is, I think, what constricts a lot of people to just, it's not very interesting. I think maybe it's time to talk about something I want to talk about, which is it's perceived probably to be an all-white genre, and I think it sort of is. And it's something I want to talk about because if medieval romances come to develop, which I really wanted to, I really don't want them to become the hockey romances of the historical Roman subgenre, if you know what I mean, which is a place where all characters are white, all the authors are white, and this is maybe like a white escapist place. I don't know how it is in America, but in Europe, um, the medieval times are associated with white supremacists, and they use those aesthetics a lot in the in general, the Crusades. And so even like I'm attending a medieval event next week, I had to double check everything to make sure they were not white supremacists in attendance, or it was not organized by white supremacists, because I know the kind of people who attend those events. So here I made a little slide where I tried maybe to maybe change some ideas people can have about um, like medieval time, and maybe how white they really were or how they were not, and that maybe cultural diversity could be found in medieval time. So, what's really important is that for a long time, the Mediterranean is very connected. So people travel, people meet, people change places. We have here the example of Eusebius, who was a bishop of Paris in the 6th century, who is reported to be Syrian. So Syrian is a bit of a everything word. Usually meant you were from the East or something. Maybe you were Greek. Maybe you were from very different modern places. But there was this man, and then later Gregory of Tours in the 5th century describes something happening in Orleans, and he describes a large crowd composed of Syrians again, which are a number of people from Central Middle East, the Byzantine Empire. So even France, or the France of the time, was not an all-white land full of knights and people. And even later, in the other later Middle Ages, we have reports of interactions between people in Ethiopia and Europe, people traveling. So I think there's a lot of space for people to explore what they want in medieval time. And of course, we can talk about historical accuracy or whatever, but even within this, there's so much space for people to do whatever they want.
This
Sorry, I
is
just ramble for a long time.
No, this is so fascinating. You've said several things that I'm like mentally flagging because I had not considered them before. One, I think that your perspective on how a kind of a European context for how the medieval period is romanticized for white supremacists is very fascinating to me, because that definitely a different perspective on how that time period and images of that time period are used in bad faith, for propaganda and for other campaigns. So that's really interesting. You said something earlier that truly was a stopping moment for me, because I had not previously considered the thought of, even in trying to research this time period and looking at, you've done the majority of your research. You're working with French language sources,
Yes.
and for, a publishing crowd that is very American, and Americans have developed some comfort with writing their kind of fantastical British stories, but certainly aren't reading, outside those primary English sources, if they're even doing that, if they're doing, true historical research versus just building on what they perceive of the Regency or these common time periods. So that just alone, that the language barriers and, those in privilege who are not doing research in other languages to better understand these time periods, that alone is huge. And I had not thought about that as being a barrier for this specific period.
That reminds me of a couple of years ago I got like an ancestry kit and I didn't actually do the spit test, but I got on the family tree portion of their website where you can look at documents and like connect yourself to your ancestors. And the parts of my family where everybody comes from Ireland, it was so easy to just go back and back and back and back and back and back and back. And the parts of my family that come from Quebec, that come from Norway and Denmark, it was like great grandparent dead end because I don't speak those languages, you know, and I couldn't figure out what these documents were saying. So you imagine as an author, if you're setting out to write and you're curious about a time period, you're going to be somewhat limited by like how deep you're willing to go into sources that are not in the language that you read comfortably. That's a really interesting point. But you know what?
Yeah,
I was really struck by what you said about how romantasy is medieval.
I never, yes.
That like that I've been that's been like since you said that. Like people do like medieval setting. They like it when it's pretend. They like it when it's romantasy.
Well,
And
yes.
and also very white
and
because
it's
romanticy is very white. You know what
romantasy is very white.
connected all this?
Yeah. I mean, about the language thing, I think I'm going to say something it's a bit controversial. I think what we consider medieval and medieval aesthetics are very French. I mean that in the way that people usually talk about 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century, which is a time where English nobility spoke French, right? They were like the kings of France married their daughters to the King of England, which led to the Hundred Years' War and everything. So the culture, what we consider knights, whatever, is very closely related to France. So we've had access to the French language for a number of research and essays and whatever, because French professors only write in French, you are very limited to some extent. I mean, of course, American and English speaking professor publish things, but you are cutting yourself off from a good number of sources, research. But that is to say, I think medieval is a lot broader than just France, England at that time. And it's open to literally every part of the Mediterranean and even more countries. And I really, really would like people to maybe see and explore those things. But again, they're limited by the language for the research because people research in the local language and write in the local languages.
Alix, can you bring us back briefly to the medieval timeline of like when it begins?
Yes.
Okay, so I guess this is still like the Roman era, but I was just reading about how like white supremacists in England are using the like English flag, the St. George flag to represent like we only care about English people, not Greater Britain or not like, you know, whoever else has immigrated to England, whatever. But I was reading this morning that St. George, he died in like 303. So he's, I think, Roman,
Yes.
not Middle Ages. But he was Turkish
He's
and
from Antioch.
Palestinian.
Yes.
And
Yes,
he
he's from
and
Antioch.
but when you Google him, it's like where did he die? It says Palestine, Syria. Like
Yeah.
which is
So
to your point of like Syria is just
medieval Syria covered part of Turkey and a lot of the region. So it's very complicated when someone says Syria in an old text. You're like, I don't really know what you're talking about. But you
a
probably
big
don't know either because you've never been. But to your point, see, for example, Joan of Arc. I know she's quite popular amongst American crowds, and I don't know if it's a well-known fact, but she's a symbol for white supremacists, for the far right in France, right? It's an entire topic. So because a lot of people see her talk about her in gender studies, in American gender studies I read, and I'm like, complicated topic because it's a bit difficult to talk about her in France without the association with the far right.
That is so interesting. And yes, not something that I would have been aware of. And what those kind of cultural red flags or cultural touch points that you have when you're more familiar with even just like a European context. Because again, I think that in American studies, we have cherry picked and selected these tiny little figures out. And so we lack all context. So we would not pick up on the nuance of why this might be a figurehead for X because we've only studied like the one battle or the one story that we think exemplifies heroism. You know, we have such a hero culture. And so it really deprives us of that sense of full context and how these would be pictured by modern day people. It's fascinating. I also, so I was thinking about that. I'm working through the Count of Monte Cristo right now, in the unabridged version, and like many American middle schoolers read a very abridged version, you know, in seventh grade, but have never read the unabridged. And it wasn't until I was reading notes on translation that it also made me stop and think about the ways English and French have evolved in those same years at different paces and how that changes, you know, the art of translation back and forth. And so I just really appreciate your context for language barriers and how that impacts the research that people are willing to do and what they take on. Even in the sources you selected for our roundup, I know there were several where you were describing to me like, this is the best source for queer lives at this time, but there's no American translation. You know, that
I mean it. I think that Clovis Meyer, Les gens fluides is the best book for discussing trans identity or in relation to sainthood. I think there's no equivalent. The other books, which is trans and non-binary subjects in medieval hagiography, is just not the same and not as detailed, and it frustrates me to no end every time I have to discuss this book.
yeah, so interesting. Well, that also leads me to my next question, thinking about the history of queer and trans people living throughout this as well as later time periods, and how that was relevant to your research process, because I know this is something that you've read very intentionally and you were very intentional in how you brought your research into your story. So tell us more about what you have found in your own reading on queer and trans lives during the medieval period.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two things. Wait, I have slide. Yes. Maybe I'll start with maybe what the church said in the fourth century, which is that they put out a number of rules and like clarified them because usually when they put up those rules, it means things were happening before that point and they had to forbid it. So here we have particularly, this is more focused on women wearing men's clothing, cutting off their hair, leaving their husbands or children. There's also like this council was like against being vegetarian, and so
Sure.
forth, and also against freeing slaves. So here you go. And I think it's very relevant that this is what the church said about women behaving, or at least people who were assigned women behaving in those times. Because there is this phenomenon of the late antiquity, early medieval, that there is a number of saints that are what we could call nowadays transmasculine. Is they're found throughout medieval legends, and when people write the lives of saints, they pop up here and there. We have the example of Saint Pelagius or Pelagian, who lived in the 4th century and was perceived to be a very beautiful woman, and then found God, joined a monastery as Brother Pelagius. A lot of what happened is that those people often said they were eunuch, and people left them alone, and then were discovered after death. And so this specific Saint Pelagius is mentioned in As Old As Thyme, which is why I singled him out. But there's actually quite a number of people who had what I would call this proto-transmasculinity, which is we have a number of stories. So either they are stories, they are lives of saints, or they are fictional, where someone who was assigned female at birth just decides to, from different circumstances, cross-dresses, and lived for a significant part of his life as a man. Of course, they are often given a reason because this is just someone else telling the story, and they are either discovered female after dying, or they are accused of rape, and this happens in a lot of stories. They're accused of rape, and they're like, no, actually, I couldn't have done that, leaving aside how they perceived rape at that time. And we have certain list of people who discovered upon death and were very careful of concealing their identity. So a different Pelagius from the one I mentioned, I believe, which lived as a monk, was later made saint. Marinos, also a monk who was falsely accused of rape, did not reveal himself and was discovered upon death. Another Pelagius, they were called Pelagius, who was an abbot, became a saint. We have another monk. So a lot of people. And this category reminds me a bit of Dr. James Barry, who was also very careful, so from much later in history, who is very careful about not revealing his identity and this being discovered upon death. And then we have the people who were forced to reveal themselves after being accused of rape. So Saint Eugenia. Silence from, you may have heard the story of Silence. There's also been a retelling published in recent years, who lived as a sort of minstrel and character. And then finally, we have the weird case of Id, who was a knight who married a woman and pretended to be a boy for most of his childhood. And then God just grant him magical transition. So in medieval time, the idea of what we call now transmasculinity is not unheard of. It exists in stories. And there's this, so this exists. What lacks from story is usually the idea of transfemininity. So I've called this maybe more the trials of transfemininity. The examples we have, they come from characters who are, so the trans men, they became saints. The trans women, they are revealed and put through trials. So there's this dichotomy that we still see sometimes nowadays, but we had two cases of trans women sex workers, if we use modern terms, who were real people who were put on trial, and we have the records of their trial. And we have in the trial the idea that those two women lived as women, appeared themselves as women, presented themselves as women, and then they were trialed under sodomy laws in the 14th century in Venice and London. And another source which I really like is that in this, one of probably the earliest books with some novellas, short stories from the 15th century, we have a story, I'm not going to read the entire thing, which is story 45, which is called The Scotsman's Turned Washerwoman, and who described the life of a washerwoman who lives for 14 years in Rome as a washerwoman and is discovered, and then she is exposed and then punished for her air quoting crimes. And what is very interesting about this story, because I've read it, and I just put the reference because I'm not going to read the whole thing, is that in some way the transmisogyny we see is very reminiscent of 19 comedies, right? Where it's very comical to expose a trans woman after she's had maybe sex with other people. And we have at the end a trans nudity, which is meant to be funny or satisfying punishment for a disgusted audience. Yet the character is described as maintaining herself and conducting herself in a woman's state and attire. With the medieval society, it's a society of order, right? You can't go out. You have to wear special clothes depending on the job you wear. If you're a woman or a man, you have very different behaviors. So for someone to fully put themselves as a woman, like this was a very clear indicator of the time. And this is a story, right? But someone wrote this story, yes, for a comical purpose, but they knew of the idea that someone could live and perform as the other gender. So now we would say this person is likely trans. And this was not out of the ordinary. Oh, maybe it was out of the ordinary, but it existed. That's what I mean. I get very frustrated with people who are like, yeah, trans people didn't exist before this time or whatever. The general audience had those stories. They existed in stories. There was this idea, like it's not out of nowhere. And about queer people in general, I was thinking about Charlemagne, who wrote a law in the 9th century, and he was like, monks should stop having sexual relationships between each other. And the thing is, if Charlemagne says this, he probably has heard of it, and it's probably something that is happening. You don't just write an extra law on something that's technically already forbidden by the church, being like, yeah, we really should stop those behaviors. So yeah, I would say queer and trans identity were very, I mean, they were forbidden and probably persecuted at the time, but they were well known enough that people were like, yeah, that exists. That is something that could happen
Well,
during this time.
and to your point too, I think we can see the reality through stories at a time when it would not have been safe to write, at specific periods in time where it wouldn't have been safe to write that in nonfiction. You weren't going to tell the real story of yourself or your neighbor, but you could write a comedy. You could write, other forms to call upon this kind of history and this kind of identity. Um, so that is what we have to help document that record.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very frustrated about the whole Bridgerton discourse recently. So I may be going on a rant about,
Let's
I've been going on a
go.
rant about this recently. But the idea that what is now perceived as socially progressive being is anachronistic is a bit stupid because they perceive social progress as linear, which it's not.
Yes.
And therefore, like, yeah, if someone is getting that time, that is actually social progress, so they should not exist. And the saying, "Oh, this is anachronistic," is just a way to shut down voices from the past. These people existed. They probably had a very secret, like dangerous existence, but you have, I mean, it's kind of the debate. You have no proof they existed or they didn't exist. But we know enough that they probably did and probably lived their lives in some way.
Yes. And to your point that social progress is not linear, we are currently living in a time in parts of the world where it is incredibly dangerous to be queer and trans. And there were times before now where it was safer at different periods. And so this is not a straight line where we can just say everything today is better, everything then was worse. And so if you have any hope of a happily ever after, it can't happen in the, insert time period. It's
Yeah.
just so short-sighted.
I have this extra slide, I think, on the topic, and I think this also brings on a point, is that we know things and then we forget things and rediscover things. And this goes with the idea of progress. It's my slide about medieval transition. In As Old As Thyme, I invent the idea that they could have accessed HRT from knowledge. They probably couldn't. I'm very aware that this is probably not real, but at least I try to make it believable. Here, I suggested something that could have been real, probably not, but a character could have realistically accessed, is that from the 7th century to the 15th century, there were known surgery for, I mean, breast reduction in men usually, but there was a technique, there were like records on how to treat this, and then throughout the medieval period, consistently people had this treaty and exchanged this and knew about this, and there were different techniques that kind of changed. So, like, if you wanted to write a medieval male main character, he could have some scars, and you could have this because I know something that repels a lot of queer people from medieval stories is the fact that they cannot have any sort of bodily autonomy,
Mhm.
and that this was a very harsh time. And I'm trying to show that you could have more diverse stories, and you could have things with some research and from identifying what could have been.
Yes. And I think it's beautiful, this idea that why, yes, maybe we don't have any documented, research that would suggest that they, that the village wise woman could concoct, some homemade HRT. But we also don't have any evidence that they didn't, they had the same
Exactly.
creativity we have today. They have
Exactly.
the same desires and the same. So why would we presume that this is impossible?
Or even this, like the epitome of medicine, describing
Yeah.
double incision surgery for, you said, for men who wanted breast reduction. So we know that like coroners of the Victorian and Regency eras would say that a person had died by misadventure if they didn't want to write suicide on a
Yeah.
cause of death, right? So
Yeah.
there's nothing that keeps us from knowing for sure that people weren't like doing top surgery for trans mask people
Yeah.
and then being like, well, this man had excess breast tissue and it was making the battlefield real tricky, so we handled it. It's like there's nothing telling
Yeah,
us that
exactly.
wasn't happening.
Yep. So interesting. And this also is a great lead in to, I want to talk a little bit, Alex, about your experience and your credentials to write about medieval HRT and talk a little bit about your female main character, who is our village wise woman, medieval apothecary of sorts, is working with a lot of chemistry. So tell us a little bit about your own background in chemistry, um, and how that informed your storytelling.
Yeah, so I'm currently doing a PhD in material chemistry. I do have a background in all sorts of chemistry, but yeah, my main topic is material science and in general plastics, which, as you know, is probably 100 years old and not very appropriate to write about in historical romances. But this entire story, like as time started, when I looked up in the history of HRT, and I wondered how feasible is that? You may have heard the story that there were some Scythians who feminized themselves by drinking pregnant mare urine in the antiquity. I don't know. It's a rumor that goes on online sometimes, and I believe there are no exact proof of that. Potentially, there are some very vague sources. But I started to think, I mean, we initially made estrogen we extracted it from pregnant mare urine, that's Premarin. And I looked up the patent and I was like, actually, that's quite doable. Mostly it's a liquid extraction, which I knew they didn't know about. Like, those are techniques that they didn't know about. And for that, you could use ethyl acetate, which is an ester that can easily be made from vinegar and wine. They probably didn't know how to do it, but I wanted to give them a way to do it. Like, this was doable. They had the material they had everything to do it. They just lacked the knowledge to do that. So I really tried to make it believable that this is part of some knowledge that was passed down. So they just not come up with this idea, but instead learn from generation. And I think you could figure out some things. I think you can figure out liquid extraction from observation. And I think that's what I try to do with this whole medieval chemistry thing. You have both character, Bruno and Theodoric, which represent two sides of chemistry. He's more of an inorganic chemist, and he has learned from the more academic sources. So it's not set in details, but at the time they had this theory that things are cold or hot, they are wet or dry, and there's this whole theory. So he's more from this sort of academic things, whereas Bruno is completely different. She's never heard of the entire theory, but that's also great for her because her entire chemistry is based on knowledge, observation, and that sets her apart that she can develop new things from just looking at this chemistry, and she's not too influenced by what was the actual science of the time. And because she probably wouldn't have been able to access the science of the time as a woman and as someone living in a rural village in general. But instead, I made it as passed down from generation of women who have worked on this, developed this. Uh, I mean, I made sure that the knowledge is both descended from potentially Druids and maybe more Greek or Roman researchers. That's also why I needed to set the story as early as possible so that the knowledge did not die down during the centuries. Um, but that was my observation, is that theoretically it could have been possible. There's a lot of I mean, it's limited. It probably wouldn't have worked well. You needed a good testosterone blocker, which they didn't really have. Like, there's a lot of problems with this. But honestly, if you're not very deep into biochemistry, you would be like, oh yeah, makes
Yep.
sense.
Made sense to me. I don't have the biochemistry background. And so, but also, again, I really appreciate your focus too on Bruno having the experience as a rural person who would not have access to medical literature, what we would have perceived as like medical literature, which is like, literature written by men, during specific time periods and blessed by very specific people, and that she was learning through observation, trial and error, through oral traditions that were passed down. I was just thinking about this. Emily and I recently were doing podcasts on quilting and different textile arts, and there was one specific storyline where they were talking about how like our only history of this specific quilt style is oral history. We don't have anything written because of, it was the period of the Underground Railroad, and you would not have written that down. You would not have written down your secret codes, for certain kinds of quilt patterns. And that's not less relevant. Oral history is how we preserve at risk or high stakes or very dangerous history during different periods of time. So yeah, why isn't it possible? Why couldn't they have observed the same things that we observed later, that we actually
I
documented?
mean, also she can't read or write.
Yeah,
That's also what's very fun about writing at this time period is remember, they
yeah,
can't read or write. So you're going to
yeah.
have to work with that.
Yeah,
And she's
that
learning
I
from a
always
mentor.
I always tell my husband, and sorry, scientists who will watch this, but I always tell my husband that I believe every old wives' tale for this reason. I'm like, just because the people who came up with this wisdom couldn't read or write, didn't have the means to record keep, didn't have the money for a study, nobody gave them a grant or a lab or, whatever. Like, just because they didn't have like the privilege of scientifically documenting their findings doesn't mean that they were just like repeating these traditions for shits and giggles. Like they did things because they worked. They
Yeah.
relied on this wisdom and they passed it down orally. So, I mean, and then I was like, as a joke, I was like, and that's why I know that you can dangle your wedding ring above a pregnant belly to be able to tell the sex of the baby. like within limitations. I have a lot of faith in old wives' tales because there's information that's not safe to record keep, that's not valued by those in charge of record keeping. And there are just a myriad of reasons why some information is taken more seriously and some is taken less seriously that are not strictly, well, this is true and this isn't.
Yeah.
But vaccines are real.
Yes.
I love your balance, Emily. Thank you for being
I'm just
our old
imagining
wives'
like
tale.
Debbie or Jillian being like, Emily, what?
You're not going to kick you out. I also want to talk a little bit about the craft of the story and your selection of your main characters because we've talked so much about your research and why you wrote to represent very specific topics and representations during this period of time, but also we're all romance readers, and so most of the joy in reading your story is like these are childhood best friends who rediscover each other. We have a charlatan who is trying to, get away with a scheme. We have, Bruno who is trying to survive and trying to, help and protect other people in her community. And so there's some real stakes while never feeling too dangerous. We have the safety of, we are apart from kind of the warring classes in this time period. But want to talk a little bit about one, like what character setups do you most enjoy playing with? Why did you choose childhood friends to lovers? What about this specific setup was most fun for you?
I mean, as a reader, I just really love Friends to Lover because I have this very common criticism that it never feels like the characters fall in love in a realistic timeline. It always feels like it's too fast or whatever, and they don't know each other. I'm like, oh, you've known each other. It's like Frozen. You've known each other for a week. Why are you in love? So friends to lover, and especially childhood friends to lover, you have the appeal of someone who knows you so deeply and knows everything about yourself that if you're in love with them, it's you have the tension of this could break. And for example, for Bruno, it has broken that she had this other friend she was in love with, and she didn't return her affection. Whereas here, she has they've known everything about each other, and now they fully know everything about each other. So I don't know. I just really love Friends to Lovers. There's this connection that sometimes you wonder how to create it for characters who've known each other for a week again. I do not believe in characters who fall in love in a week when I read a story. I'm very sorry to everyone about that. And I think in general, I really, really enjoy angst and character suffering. And I have not written this enough, but this is what is the most fun for me to play around. I have a bunch of work in progress, which are just scenes of character suffering after um, they have declared their love and this was not well received and everything like that. I need my characters to suffer a lot, or they're just yearning and suffering. This is what is the most fun for me to write. Unfortunately, this has not seen light of days yet.
That's
Uh,
you're speaking my language now. Bring it on. I love it. I cannot wait.
yeah, that's the problem with a PhD is that I have to write other things. So I'm a very slow writer.
That's fair. I agree though, and it's so funny too that you say that because I know that we've talked about a lot of books that that we've both read. And I remember, it's so cool when you man the Romance Lady University account, you really get to see the like trends in reading as a community goes through a specific book and all the reviews come in. So I remember when everyone was reading A Gentleman's Gentleman, and the one thing people would always say, it's a slow burn, it's a slow burn, it's a slow burn. And then Alex, I remember when you wrote it and you were like, the burn is perfect. Like the burn is exactly what I'm looking for. And it's like to your point of like people don't fall in love in a week.
I'm a very slow burn person. Unfortunately, I'm a very impatient writer. So I think it is very difficult to get that balance.
Yeah, it is tough. And authors who are able to pull it off, it's impressive. And also the suspension of disbelief,
Mhm.
getting your reader to suspend disbelief in ways that are helpful for the story without ever breaking kind of that spell of the
I
story
mean,
for some
I
time.
think Alex is getting some really good practice with that because in As Old as Time, there's nothing about the story that's like, this is fantastical. This could
Yeah.
never happen. But there is like a kernel of like, we put like just like a of like this didn't happen in here. You know what I mean? So I feel like you're well positioned to write stuff that you can just sell to us. Just sell us something whether it can happen or not. Sell it to yourself. Give yourself some strangers. Like write that the third character from this story into the next one having insta love. Somebody who could never she could never give her heart away. That's why Plunal was so heartbroken. But whoop, she just met the right person.
That's so funny. Well, I just want to thank you. You've been so generous with your time. Before we wrap up, though, because again, another thing we talk about a lot, in as just we all roll through a lot of the same books, is just where is publishing going? What do we hope for in the future of historical romance? And so I'm very curious, just in your own words, what you hope for the future of historical romance.
Yeah, so I mean, I won't dare say things about the American publishing industry because I'm not in it, I'm not connected to it in any way, so I don't want to say personally what I wish to see. So this is more of a wish in historical romances are very diverse stories in terms of time periods and places. I think we are very lacking in terms of places that are explored and authors from those backgrounds and those countries telling those stories with their own knowledge and on research. I mean, of course, time periods with the medieval, but there's massive gap, especially if you write queer stories. I mean, I think we've seen the timeline of queer stories. There's almost nothing in the antiquity, early Middle Ages. I think the Renaissance is also quite bare of queer romances in general. So I really would like maybe new authors to come to this space and realize that this could be for them and that they can share their own ideas and their own stories from wherever, whenever, especially with queer characters. And it doesn't have to be just 19th century England, because to me, the 19th century is not very I do not relate to 19th century England at all. To me, the 19th century is a period of massive political upheaval, especially in France, which had like two empires, three kings, several revolutions. there's not a dreamy period with balls to me, and I think there's a lot of there's so much more to explore than that.
Yes. It's so true. So Emily and I are currently rolling through the Joanna Bourne Spy Master series, and I was reading an interview. She writes some French spies, and it was just the reminder of like historical romance doesn't only have to write English soldiers in the Napoleonic Wars or
Yeah.
French people, like that we just
French
historical romance.
people exist.
They did, it really did, and historical romance is so English focused.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I was reading A Lady for a Duke, and there's a mention to Waterloo, to the Battle of Waterloo. And to me, Waterloo is culturally, it is a defeat. It is an atrocious defeat. And every time I read an historical romance, I'm like, what do you mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean it's great
Got
in a
this in
victory?
Waterloo. Yeah, everything
And
it's
I'm like,
everywhere.
no.
Yeah, and I also think that in just reading the Joanna Bourne series, she has all these French spies and also in reading A Bloomy Head, which was my favorite book last
Yes.
year. Everybody please read it. I love it so much. Um, you have people living through the French Revolution and not romanticizing it. Not romanticizing it for our like Americans in 2026 eat the rich off with their heads mentality. You know what I mean? Like it's very cute right now for all of us to be like Google how to build guillotine. But reading these historicals that actually get the perspective of French people surviving the terror, they don't talk about it in terms of like, this is so fun. Let's make this our reality now, and it's a little sobering and it's a little bit it's one of the things that I really love about historical romance, like getting these different perspectives and whenever we can get away from just like 19th century England, like you said, the
Yeah.
perspectives are varied. It's not yay Waterloo in every story, right?
Yeah. And about the French Revolution, I really appreciate Annick Strand's series. I'm always recommending Annick Strand's
Oh
series.
yes.
Uh, I think it's in both. I mean, I've read most of them, but in Sixpenny Octavo, there's a lot of concern. You can see that it's right after the French Revolution, and because the characters are working class, you can see the kind of repression they can be, so that they're not inspired, and how the nobility is very afraid similar things could happen. And I thought that was a really nice perspective you don't get in maybe later Regency romances.
I've only read Harvest season so far in Ani Trent series, and I have Sixpenny Octavo queued up, and I can't wait to read it. But for those who have not read any of the books in this series, would highly recommend dipping it. Harvest season is 40 pages, I think. It's
Oh,
very, very
Yeah.
short. And it's great, like worker rights and organizing, and it I think gives a flavor of what I expect going through the series. Very slice of life. It's a very dip in story. It's 40 pages, but Ani Trent is very accessible, so would highly recommend. I know I'm going to try to roll through the rest of the series this session.
nice.
Thank you again, Alix. We have learned so much, and we so appreciate your perspective, the thought that you put into not only your own writing, but your own reading and your participation in historical romance spaces. We really can't say enough just how grateful we have been for your support and participation and your input throughout this process. It's been invaluable. So thank you so much for joining us. We were so excited to be able to host you as an author and to have you here to talk about your work.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being there as well. I'm so honored. I've been to all of those sessions, and now it's me.
It's
I
you.
I know it just is such a special moment for us. So thank you, thank you. And thank you to everybody who was able to join on a Sunday evening, afternoon, morning. We're crossing lots of time
We're
zones
crossing lots of
today.
time zones today.
We'll get as Emily said, we'll get this up on YouTube as fast as we can for all of our friends who are in various places right now, celebrating historical romance, hopefully. So thank you all and have a great
Thank
rest
you
of your
all.
day.